I think it's time to look at another tube station, and today our subject is Bounds Green. The algorithm by which I decide what to make a video about is complicated, you wouldn't understand. Like Cockfosters, Southgate and Turnpike Lane, which I've also covered, Bounds Green is a station on the Cockfosters extension of the Piccadilly line. It opened in 1932. The Cockfosters extension consists of the stations north of Finsbury Park, and they were all designed under the watchful eye of company architect Charles Holden, who was himself under the watchful eye of commercial manager Frank Pick. Unlike those other stations I mentioned, Bounds Green was not actually designed by Holden himself, but by C.H. James of the architect's firm of James and Bywaters. As a result, it is definitely in the same style as the other stations on the extension, but it has a couple of features that set it apart. Note the shape. Holden's style was blocky geometric shapes, a style referred to as a brick box with a lid. It also has a ventilation tower, very similar to the one at Turnpike Lane. But the ticket hall is octagonal, which was not a shape Holden really went in for. It has large windows to let in daylight, but Holden normally put these on the sides. James puts them on the corners. The upper part of the ground level wall is rendered, which again is not a Holden feature. This is going to sound a little strange, but what it puts me in mind of is when you get a film set or a theme park outside of the UK and they try to recreate a tube station, but they don't get it quite right. Now I come to think of it, this is a pretty weird thing to say. This real tube station looks like a fake tube station because it has features that a real tube station doesn't have. I mean, I'm not saying I don't like it, I just think it's curious. The station opened on the 19th of September 1932. That being said, it wasn't totally complete. Finishing touches were still being added into 1933. It might also have been called Wood Green North or Brownlow Road. It was considered that Wood Green might be called Wood Green Central during development, so perhaps the idea was that Wood Green North would complement that. But anyway, that's not how things worked out, so Bounds Green it was. It would be less than a decade before the station suffered a tragic mishap. During the Second World War, Bounds Green, like many stations on the Underground, was used as an air raid shelter by locals. On the 13th of October 1940 at 9:15 p.m, a lone bomber dropped a single heavy bomb. It fell on two houses about 120 yards from the main station building, killing 4 residents. It blew a massive crater in the road, 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Unfortunately, this was just the start of the disaster. As it was the evening, coming around to bedtime for many people, the platform was occupied with shelterers. Barely would they have had time to realise what had happened before the cast-iron tunnel roof above the southbound platform ruptured. Some 200 tons of soil and debris roared through the hole, burying people alive. 16 were killed, with a 17th later dying of his injuries. The figures for the injured that I've come across are inconsistent. Some say around 20, some go as high as 59. Ironically, some of those killed and injured had only been sheltering here because their own houses had been bombed in previous raids. 6 of those killed were children, and the youngest, Pauline Mandel, was only 18 months old. There is a plaque commemorating the disaster, but it's a little controversial. The plaque states that most of those killed were Belgian refugees. Records seem to indicate that in fact only 3 of those killed were Belgian. To be honest, this isn't the first time I've come across confusion as to the victims of wartime bombings. There are similar questions around the number of victims at Balham. The fact is that in the chaos of war, records were often not collated and cross-referenced as efficiently as they might have been. The scene of the disaster must have been somewhat surreal. At street level and all the way down to the platforms, the station was unscathed. The lights still worked and the escalators hadn't even stopped. But down below, the impact had been so powerful that the northbound tunnel had actually shifted, evidenced by cracks in the concrete and the tiling. And somehow, the end of the platform had been forced 3 inches towards the track. One Colonel Mount produced a report on the incident, which of course contained information that would be superseded by later revelations. It was his opinion that Bounds Green had not been the intended target, but rather the main line into King's Cross a few hundred yards away. It seemed that the whole thing had been an awful mistake. Repairs were not begun until the 25th of October. Removing the bodies was a difficult and, as you might imagine, very unpleasant task. And no less challenging was figuring out how to rebuild the station afterwards. Eventually, on the 16th of December, Bounds Green reopened. Aside from the usual maintenance and upgrades, the post-war history of Bounds Green has been fairly uneventful. It was made a listed building in 2008, partly because of its unusual design and partly because of the wartime disaster. Bounds Green is, in many ways, a fairly typical suburban underground station. It has its unique features, but it's not one that on the whole tends to get a lot of attention. It's perhaps sad, then, that its greatest claim to fame is a single wartime tragedy. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Thanks as ever to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, and I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.